There's a specific kind of dread that arrives the moment a familiar name lights up your phone after months, sometimes years, of complete silence. It isn't the same dread you might feel from a stranger's unwanted message. This one hits somewhere deeper, because it arrives carrying an entire history with it, every unresolved question you thought you'd finally released, every piece of hope you'd worked so hard to extinguish, suddenly flaring back to life with a single notification. And in that exact moment, before any conscious decision has even been made, your thumb is already hovering over the screen, and something in you is already drafting a reply. This is the moment we're examining today, and I want to be direct about what makes it so difficult, because most advice about this exact situation stops at a single instruction: don't reply. That advice isn't wrong, but it's incomplete because it leaves you with nothing to actually do instead, which means the silence itself becomes a kind of empty space, one that anxiety, curiosity, and old habit rush in to fill the moment discipline alone starts to waver. What we're exploring today goes further than simply telling you to resist replying. We're going to walk through exactly what to do in that place instead, something considerably more concrete and considerably more sustainable than pure willpower alone. Let's start by understanding why the instinct to reply feels so overwhelming in this exact moment, because understanding the mechanism is what makes resisting it considerably more manageable. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what silence after a relationship actually represents. If genuine healing has occurred, silence has likely become something considerably more than mere avoidance. It's become the actual space where your own life reorganized itself, where grief moved through its natural process, where self-trust slowly rebuilt itself, piece by piece. A sudden message after this kind of silence doesn't just represent an interruption. It represents a direct challenge to the entire structure you've built. And this is precisely why the pull to respond feels so much stronger than an ordinary decision about whether to answer a text. Here's what's worth understanding about the specific psychological mechanism at work in this exact moment. The message arrives carrying what we might call unfinished business energy, activating exactly the parts of your mind that spent months or years constructing explanations, imagining conversations, wondering how things might have gone differently. Even after genuine healing, these neural pathways don't disappear entirely. They simply go quiet, and a sudden message reactivates them with startling speed, producing a rush of urgency that feels considerably more compelling than any ordinary curiosity would. This is worth understanding not as evidence that you haven't actually healed, but as a predictable, temporary reactivation of pathways that were genuinely quiet. Precisely because reactivation and permanent relapse are not the same thing, even though they can feel remarkably similar in the first few minutes after a message arrives. Let's talk about why replying, even a brief, careful, seemingly harmless reply, tends to cause considerably more damage than most people expect going in. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about how these dynamics actually function once contact resumes. A single reply doesn't function as a single isolated event. It functions as evidence to them that the channel remains open, evidence to your own nervous system that engagement is still available as an option, and evidence, most importantly, that reopens exactly the uncertainty that silence had been quietly resolving. This is worth understanding precisely, because the danger isn't really in the specific content of whatever reply gets sent. It's in what replying itself communicates, regardless of how carefully worded or how brief that reply happens to be. This brings us to the core problem with the simple instruction to just don't reply, because understanding why it's insufficient reveals what actually needs to happen instead. Telling yourself not to reply while sitting there with the message open, phone in hand, mind already racing through possibilities, is asking willpower alone to override a genuinely powerful, reactivated pull in real time without any other outlet for the energy that pull has just generated. This is considerably harder than it sounds, and it's precisely why so many people who genuinely intend never to respond find themselves hours or days later having typed out exactly the reply they swore they wouldn't send. So let's introduce what actually needs to happen instead, the practical alternative this exploration's title refers to. Rather than simply resisting the urge to reply, The goal is to redirect the exact energy that urge represents into something concrete, something that actually processes and metabolizes the reactivated pull, rather than simply suppressing it and hoping suppression alone will be enough to hold. This redirection has a specific structure worth understanding clearly, because it isn't simply distract yourself with something unrelated, which tends to fail precisely because the pull is specific and searching for a specific kind of resolution, not a general one. Here's the first step worth taking, and it's worth doing immediately, in the exact moment the message arrives, before any decision about replying has even had time to fully form. Write down, somewhere private, exactly what you're feeling and exactly what you want to say to them, in full, unfiltered, with no restraint whatsoever. This isn't a message you'll ever send. It's a container for the exact energy that's currently demanding an outlet. And writing it down, in full, uncensored detail, provides that outlet without requiring you to actually deliver it into their hands. This step matters because the urge to reply isn't really about the specific words you'd send. It's about the pressure of having something unsaid, something demanding expression, and this pressure can often be genuinely relieved through expression alone, entirely independent of whether that expression ever reaches its intended recipient. What we haven't yet covered is what comes after this first step, why writing without sending genuinely differs from simply suppressing the urge, and what additional practical actions complete this alternative approach, transforming it from a single technique into a genuine, repeatable practice you can rely on every single time contact unexpectedly resurfaces, regardless of how much time has passed or how settled you believed yourself to be before the message arrived. Let's talk about why writing without sending genuinely differs from simply suppressing the urge, because this distinction matters considerably more than it might initially seem. And understanding it explains why this specific technique works when pure willpower alone consistently fails. Here's the key difference worth understanding precisely. Suppression asks you to hold an activated feeling in place, unexpressed, while continuing to function normally around it, and this holding requires ongoing, active effort that tends to weaken over time, especially under the pressure of a message sitting there, unanswered, continuing to demand attention with every passing hour. Writing without sending does something considerably different. It allows the actual content of what you're feeling to move through you and find expression, completing something psychologists often describe as an action loop, the natural cycle of impulse, expression, and release that gets interrupted, sometimes painfully, when an impulse is simply blocked rather than genuinely processed. This is worth understanding as the reason this technique tends to produce genuine relief rather than simply prolonged tension, because it isn't asking you to hold anything back. It's giving the impulse somewhere real to go, just not toward the person who originally triggered it. Let's talk about the second step in this practical approach, one that builds directly on the first. After writing your full, unfiltered response, read back through what you've written and specifically identify the actual need underneath it. This is worth doing deliberately, because the surface content of what you've written, whatever anger, hurt, or explanation it contains, usually sits on top of something more fundamental, a genuine, specific need that the message reactivated. Sometimes this need is for acknowledgement, wanting them to finally understand what their actions cost you. Sometimes it's for closure, wanting a clear, definitive answer to a question that's remained genuinely unresolved. Sometimes it's simply for connection itself, a wish, even after everything, that things could have been different between you. Here's why identifying this underlying need matters so much, connecting directly to something we traced extensively in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding separating the apology you wanted from the function you actually needed it to serve. Once you've identified the actual need sitting underneath the urge to reply, you can ask a considerably more useful question than, should I respond to this message? You can ask instead, how can this specific need actually be met, given everything I now understand about this person's genuine capacity to meet it? In almost every case, once this question gets asked honestly, the answer reveals something important. The need was never actually going to be met through a reply to this specific message, regardless of how carefully worded that reply might be, because the underlying capacity required to meet it, was never reliably present in this relationship in the first place. Silence or no silence, message or no message. Let's talk about the third and final practical step, one that completes this approach and transforms it from a single reactive technique into something considerably more sustainable. Physically or digitally moving the unsent message somewhere separate from your immediate environment and then deliberately, consciously redirecting your attention toward a specific, previously planned activity, ideally something that engages your body rather than only your mind. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from vague, generic distraction, because the specificity matters enormously here. Having a predetermined activity ready in advance, something you can turn to immediately rather than having to decide on something in the moment while still under the influence of reactivated urgency, removes an entire layer of decision-making that tends to fail precisely when it's needed most. Here's why engaging your body specifically matters, connecting to something we discussed in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding the relationship between sustained stress and physical experience. The reactivation we discussed at the beginning of this exploration doesn't only happen in your thoughts. It happens physiologically, in your actual nervous system, producing genuine physical arousal, an accelerated heart rate, tension, restlessness. That pure mental redirection alone often struggles to fully resolve. Physical activity, whether that's a walk, exercise, or simply focused physical work like cleaning or cooking, helps metabolize this physiological activation directly, considerably more effectively than trying to think your way out of a state that isn't purely mental to begin with. Let's bring these three steps together now, because understanding them as a complete sequence, rather than three separate, disconnected suggestions, is what makes this approach genuinely repeatable and genuinely reliable, regardless of how many times contact unexpectedly resurfaces over the years. When a message arrives after silence, first, write the full unfiltered response you're not going to send, allowing the activated impulse somewhere real to go. Second, identify the actual need underneath what you've written, and honestly assess whether replying to this specific message could actually meet that need, given everything you already know about this person's genuine capacity to meet it. Third, physically separate yourself from the message and redirect your activated energy toward a predetermined, ideally physical activity, allowing your nervous system to genuinely settle rather than remaining suspended in unresolved tension. This sequence is worth understanding as considerably more reliable than willpower alone, precisely because it doesn't ask you to simply resist an activated impulse through sheer force. It gives that impulse somewhere real to go, examines what it's actually asking for, and then allows your body and attention to genuinely settle elsewhere, rather than remaining locked in a battle against an urge that, left unaddressed, tends to grow stronger rather than weaker the longer it goes unmet. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what happens over time as you practice this sequence repeatedly, why each successful instance actually makes the next one easier rather than harder, and what this entire process ultimately builds towards something considerably more valuable than simply successfully avoiding a single reply. Let's talk about what actually happens over time as you practice this three-step sequence repeatedly, because this is where the real, lasting value of this entire approach becomes clear, considerably more valuable than what any single successful non-reply could offer on its own. Here's what's worth understanding about the first few times you use this sequence. It will likely feel effortful, deliberate, almost mechanical, requiring conscious attention to each step in order to actually complete them. This is normal, and it's worth naming directly, because people often expect a technique like this to feel immediately natural, and when it doesn't, they sometimes conclude it isn't working. What's actually happening during these early attempts is considerably more valuable than immediate ease would suggest. Each time you successfully move through all three steps, writing the unsent message, identifying the actual underlying need, and redirecting your activated energy toward something physical and predetermined, you're building a genuine, lived alternative to the old pathway, the one that used to lead directly from message received to reply sent, sometimes within minutes, before conscious thought even had a chance to intervene. This is worth understanding through something we've touched on throughout other explorations in this series regarding accumulated evidence, though it's worth applying specifically here, because it explains why repetition matters so much. Every successful completion of this sequence becomes direct, lived proof that the old pathway isn't actually inevitable, that the activated urge, however powerful it feels in the moment, can genuinely be met and resolved without requiring contact with them at all. This proof accumulates slowly, the same way self-trust accumulates slowly, through repeated instances rather than through a single decisive moment. And this accumulation is precisely what makes each subsequent instance genuinely easier than the one before it. Not because the urge itself becomes weaker on its own, but because your own confidence in your ability to meet and resolve it without replying grows stronger with each successful repetition. Let's talk about something worth naming honestly here, because it's important for setting realistic expectations rather than an idealized picture that might set you up for unnecessary self-criticism. This sequence won't necessarily prevent every single urge to reply from feeling powerful, especially in the earliest instances of contact resurfacing after a long stretch of silence. What it will do, reliably, is give you somewhere real to direct that power, rather than leaving you with nothing but willpower alone standing between the urge and an actual reply. And if, despite using this sequence, you do end up replying at some point, this isn't evidence that the approach failed or that you've undone whatever progress you'd made. It's simply information, worth examining honestly rather than judged harshly, about which part of the sequence might need more attention or practice going forward. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, one that connects this specific, practical technique to something considerably larger this entire series has been building toward. This three-step sequence isn't really at its core about successfully avoiding a reply to any single message. It's a concrete, repeatable practice for something we've discussed throughout this entire series in more abstract terms. The ability to fully feel and process an activated emotional pull without needing external action, particularly action directed toward the person who triggered it in order to find resolution. This capacity, once genuinely built through repeated practice, extends considerably beyond this specific situation. It becomes a genuine skill available to you in any future moment where old patterns threaten to resurface, whether that involves this particular person or any other situation entirely, where an old, familiar pull toward immediate reactive action needs somewhere real to go instead of simply being white-knuckled through on willpower alone. Let's close with something important worth understanding about what this entire practice ultimately builds toward, because it's considerably more valuable than simply successfully weathering any single instance of contact resurfacing. Each time you move through this sequence, and particularly each time you complete the second step honestly, identifying the actual underlying need and recognizing clearly that this specific person was never actually capable of reliably meeting it. You're not just avoiding a reply. You're deepening something we've traced throughout this entire series as one of the most valuable outcomes available from surviving these dynamics. An increasingly accurate, increasingly trustworthy internal compass. One that no longer requires their input, their response, or their acknowledgement in order to function completely on its own. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've explored today, let it be this. The goal was never simply to become someone who never feels the pull to reply when contact unexpectedly resurfaces after silence. That pull, especially in the earliest instances, may well continue arriving for longer than you'd prefer, activated by old pathways that take genuine time and genuine practice to fully quiet. The goal was always something more achievable and ultimately more valuable, becoming someone who has somewhere real to direct that pull when it arrives. Someone who can write the full, unfiltered response without needing to send it, someone who can honestly identify what they're actually longing for and recognize clearly whether this specific source could ever reliably provide it, and someone who can redirect activated energy toward a life that continues moving forward, regardless of how many more times an old, familiar name might someday light up a screen, long after you believed that particular chapter had already fully closed. Let's talk about one more piece of this worth naming directly because it addresses something people rarely discuss when talking about resisting contact. What to do with the specific version of yourself that shows up in these moments, the one who still, after everything, momentarily wants to answer. It's tempting to treat that version of yourself as a problem, something to override, silence, or feel ashamed of. This isn't accurate, and it's worth correcting directly, because shame about the urge itself tends to make the entire sequence considerably harder to complete, honestly. Here's what's actually true about that momentary pull toward replying. It doesn't represent a failure of healing, and it doesn't mean the work you've done has somehow been undone the instant a message arrives. It simply means you're a person who once invested real time, real hope, and real care into a connection with another human being, and that investment doesn't vanish the moment silence begins. Wanting to respond, even years later, even after genuine growth, isn't evidence of weakness. It's evidence that you're not someone who loved carelessly, which was never actually something worth being ashamed of in the first place. The goal was never to become a person incapable of feeling that pull. It was always to become a person who knows exactly what to do with it once it arrives. This reframe matters practically because self-judgment during this exact moment tends to add an entirely unnecessary layer of difficulty to a process that's already asking enough of you. If you notice the urge to reply and immediately follow it with harsh self-criticism, some version of, "I should be over this by now," you're spending energy fighting yourself on two fronts simultaneously: the original activated urge and the added burden of feeling bad for having it at all. Releasing that second layer, simply allowing the urge to be present without treating its presence as evidence of failure, tends to make the entire three-step sequence considerably easier to move through cleanly. Let's talk about something else worth understanding as this practice becomes more familiar over time. The messages themselves often become useful information in their own right, regardless of whether you ever reply to them. Remember everything we traced in an earlier exploration throughout this series about timing and triggers, the tendency for contact to resurface specifically around disruptions in their own life or evidence of your own visible thriving. Each time a message arrives, even unanswered, it offers a small private data point, confirming or complicating whatever pattern you've already come to understand about why and when these returns tend to happen. You don't need to reply in order to learn from a message's existence. Its simple arrival, its timing, its tone, all of this remains available to you as information, entirely separate from any decision about whether to respond. This is worth understanding as one final, quiet advantage available to you throughout this entire process. You are not merely surviving these moments, gritting your way through an unwanted intrusion until it passes. You are, each time, gathering further confirmation of everything you've already learned, deepening your own understanding, strengthening your own resolve, and proving to yourself again and again that peace was never actually dependent on their silence continuing forever, but rather on your own capacity to meet whatever arrives, message or no message, with steadiness that belongs entirely to you.